Hello and welcome to the Warhammer YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about Warcry, the new skirmish combat game set in the Age of Sigmar universe. We'll be specifically talking about the strength and toughness values and trying to figure out if these are overrated metrics. If you've been following my series of videos thus far, you've noticed that I've commented frequently about my thoughts and opinions on this, and I'd like to present you with a case with some data to show why I think these might be overrated or not. So let's get into the data. All right, let me start with a pop quiz. I have two slides of a quiz. So you can pause this and kind of answer them, and maybe it'll be fun at the end of the presentation. We'll go over the answers. So just based on your gut feeling, maybe if you've done a little data analysis yourself, maybe you have a better sense of this, but based on your gut feeling, which of these various profiles do you think is more durable? A 30 wounds 4 toughness or a 25 wounds 5 toughness? How about a 12 wounds 4 toughness or a 10 wounds 5 toughness? And lastly is comparing the same 12 versus 10 wounds, but across 3 toughness and 4 toughness. So which of these three sets of profiles do you think is more durable than the other? And for durability, let's move on to damage. Which of these attack profiles, so I have 4 pairs of attack profiles, which of these do you think is dealing more average damage output? So you can see I've highlighted which stat I've changed in each of the profiles, so they all kind of match each other, but one of them has a better, one of them is better in one category and worse than in the other category than the other profile. So in the first top left, I've just swapped the attacks and strengths values from 3 to 4. The next one over to the right, I swapped the attacks and strength values, but I've increased the strength all the way up to 5. And notably from the one to the left of it, the base damage is actually lowered by 1, so it's base damage 1, critical damage 4. And the bottom left, same thing, 4 attacks versus 3 attacks, but the critical value is lower and on the 4 attacks. So your gut feeling on how those stack up. And the bottom right, strength 5 versus strength 3, one doing 2 critical damage, the other one doing 4 critical damage. So, pause the video or take a mental note of which of these you think is stronger than the other, and we'll see the results at the end. So starting off with a fun fact that might give away quite a lot of the video if you think about it. Most of the damage dealt in the game is caused by criticals. So criticals aren't just a rare thing, even though it seems like, oh, it's only on a 6 it happens. If you look at the total amount of damage done in the game, criticals are what makes that happen. So what is the actual data on that? So the total average damage output across all the profiles in the game is 4.03 damage per activation. And criticals are responsible for 2.27 of that, and non-critical damages are responsible for 1.76 of that. So, like I said, it's quite easy, hard to refute here. Critical damage does the most damage in the game as a metric of overall damage dealt. And let's break into it in the various strength categories. So some strengths deal more in critical damage than others. So in starting from the top left, strength 6, you can see the base damage actually does more than the criticals. And as we work our way down to strength 3, the critical damage ends up doing more. And strength 4 is the point where it switches over, where the critical damage does more than the base damage. So my initial assertion that critical damage does more damage, it does the most damage in the game, that wouldn't be true if strength 5 and 6 was the entire game. So clearly that's not the case. And the reason it's not the case is because strength 3 and 4, the ones where it shifts and becomes the critical damage doing the majority of the damage output, is the most common in the game by a healthy margin, particularly if you stack them together and compare it against everything else. So the vast majority of attacks out there are coming from strength 3 and strength 4. So let's examine toughness. What is the relative effect of the different toughness values? So toughness 5, you can see regular, and I apologize for accidentally, I got the red and the blue switched up from the way this looked in the previous slides, but here the red is the critical damage and the blue is the regular damage. And as you see, against toughness 5, the critical damage is doing most of the damage across the board, and as you get to the lower toughness values, the regular damage starts to take over again. So this wouldn't be a big deal, but those lower toughness values where the standard damage starts to take over against the critical damage, those are far fewer than the higher toughness values put together. So just as an overall function of the toughness values in the game, damage is dealt mostly by criticals. Okay, let me talk first about the benefits of increasing strength. So if you take each individual profile at a certain strength level and you increase it, just take the spreadsheet numbers and add one to them, and then compare how much did the overall damage output from that attack profile increase. This is the metrics you get across the board. So you can see the lower attack profiles from 2 to 3, you only get a 9% increase by going up to strength 3. The best value from an increasing strength is moving from strength 3 to strength 4, and this is we're going to have very similar looking data on the toughness side. So as you get into higher strength values, you have quickly diminishing returns. So if you use like an ability to increase strength and you use that ability on a strength 5 character, note that it's really not affecting the game much at all. Okay. Benefit to increasing toughness, like I said, very similar looking data. Numbers only just slightly off from the types of results we saw from the increasing the strength value. So moving from 2 to 3, you get 8%. The big value coming from moving from toughness 3 to toughness 4, that adds 21% to the overall durability. And I compute these overall durability stats based on the average damage or the distribution of the various strength values that are seen in the fighter profiles in the game. So the numbers would change if, for example, they came out with a whole bunch of new warbands that are all strengths 5 and 6, then the benefits of these different toughness values would change. But as it currently stands now, this is the percentage of overall durability you get from increasing your toughness by 1. And this is an interesting... There's a lot of abilities out there in the game that provide like a +1 to toughness in an aura or something like that. So just be aware when selecting those abilities what the toughness value you're moving from and to is, because that might affect your decision on whether or not to use your double or triple for that ability as opposed to some other ability that might get you more impact in your game. Okay, moving on. So I have some direct evidence of overvalued strength, and you can also maybe make the argument that this is direct evidence of undervalued attacks. So the Untamed Beast Preytaker, there's 2 options of it, and they're the same point value. Everything is exactly identical across the board with these 2 profiles, except they've inverted the attacks and the strength value. So 3 attacks versus 4 attacks, and then 4 strength versus 3 strength, and these are pointed the exact same. So in Games Workshop's pointing algorithm, they have valued both of these 2 metrics equally. But as you can see, I've shown here the data. You can see the 2 damage, 4 crit, but then I've included in the table how this performs against toughness 2, 3, 4, and 5 individually, and in every single category, the sword profile outperforms it in terms of average damage dealt. So it not only overall, based on the distribution of the toughness values in the game, does it outperform the axe, but it outperforms it in every individual category too. So there's just absolutely no reason to take the axe. It's just a poor choice mathematically. So I think that's pretty strong evidence that they've valued strength too much and potentially devalued attacks. Unfortunately, there's not as quite conclusive damning evidence against toughness, but because there's not a single warband with 2 identical profiles where they've swapped toughness for some other stat like this. This is the perfect example here where you can just, it's completely isolated for this one variable, and you can, it's, you know, it's very provable. Toughness is a lot more nuanced, but I think since it is a correlated stat with strength, it's kind of guilty by association to some degree. Okay, we have some questionable ability values here that kind of also lend some evidence for these things being overrated. So there's a universal ability called Onslaught that everybody can use, and that adds +1 to the attacks. And if you plot out the damage output from adding 1 to attacks, it's pretty significant, and it outperforms quite a number of other abilities that warbands have, when you can add 1 to the strength, for example, or deal direct damage. So the fact that these warbands would give you this another double ability that doesn't perform as well as the universal ability that everybody has kind of gives me reason to think that maybe they didn't really value attacks properly with their pointing algorithm. So adding 1 to attacks for most things in the game is going to add a whole lot of damage output compared to, for a double, this is a very good value in general. Because attacks directly scales the critical damage, and depending on the strength and toughness you're going against, it directly scales the base damage as well. So if you're talking about a 3 attack profile and you add 1 to it and it's going to a 4 attack profile, well, now you've added 33% damage output to that profile. And if you remember from the strength chart where I was talking about moving from strength 3 to strength 4, 4 to 5, the highest percentage gain we could get from adding 1 to strength was 20. So you need to get all the way up to what, 5 attacks going to 6, I think, to match that, to not get a benefit of Onslaught versus adding 1 to strength. So Onslaught, the fact that it outperforms so many other abilities in the game, it speaks to this this problem that I've noticed of attacks being undervalued and perhaps strength being overvalued. I'm not gonna. It's not quite as conclusive, but like I said, the toughness, there's some questionable things around that. So, for example, the Stormcast Eternals have a double ability called Righteous Aura, and it provides +1 toughness for a bubble within 6 inches. Now, there's a lot of other warbands that provide the same bubble, but you got to remember, Stormcast Eternals is almost entirely toughness 5, and they have Chaff that's toughness 2. And there's the Gryph-hound, which is toughness 4, which can potentially gain, was it 14% benefit from moving from toughness 4 to toughness 5. But everything else is going to get single-digit percentage gain from a +1 toughness. So it's not very, at both extremes of the toughness scale, it doesn't provide too much value. So the fact that this is going to be a really questionable choice for Stormcast Eternals, and I think this ability providing, in this warband specifically, it gives some kind of weak evidence for me that I think that they overvalued toughness here. Okay. And there is some other weirdness with abilities in general. Like I just did a Nighthaunt video, so this one was fresh in my mind, but the Nighthaunt has an ability that adds +1 to attacks if a fellow minion is visible within 3 inches. And that's the exact same as the Onslaught ability. It has, for no reason and for no cheaper price, it has an added limitation on it. So there's no point in this ability value. So all of these questionable ability values, I will caveat here with the fact that I don't think these were particularly sorted through and balanced to the same degree as other aspects in the game, because you do have these weird things like Chilling Horde that just completely make no sense. Nobody could have compared this with Onslaught and said, yes, this needs to be priced at the same level. All right. So let's answer the pop quiz questions from before. So in our example, the 30 wounds versus the 25 wounds with the toughness difference, turns out the 30 wounds does edge out the 25 wounds. So, and if you had remembered the toughness benefit of moving from 4 to 5, you can apply that percentage gain to the 25 wounds and see that it comes up a little bit short of 30. So same with the 12 wounds versus the 10 on toughness 4 and 5. Those extra 2 wounds are more than enough to make up for moving from toughness 4 to toughness 5. But if it's making that bigger shift, remember there's was it a 21% gain in durability moving from 3 toughness to 4 toughness, so that is more than the 2 wounds. So 12 wounds just barely edges out the 10 wounds. I'm sorry, the 10 wounds just barely edges out the 12 wounds with the 1 extra toughness. But it's close. It's notably close. I think a lot of people, when they first see that profile, assume that the 10 wound is going to be a good bit tougher with the extra toughness. Okay, and the attack profiles, which of these win out? Well, the one on the top left is directly stolen from the Untamed Beast Preytaker profile that I showed earlier. So obviously the one with the more attacks wins out quite easily. That was a gimme. The top right, this one was a little bit more nuanced because we had strength 5 versus a strength 3 and only 1 attack difference, but still attacks is just a better stat. And if the criticals are the same and the attacks are different, then it's probably going to be the one with the more attacks. In general, I would say if you look at this chart, you start to see a pattern here, and that's if you really just look at the attacks and you really just look at the criticals, they are more important than the other 2 values for how much damage output is done here. Because, like I said, the majority of damage done in this game is done by criticals, and so the critical value and the number of attacks is the biggest factor. So, all right, so I hope you scored well. Actually, I hope maybe you got 1 wrong and maybe learned something from the video. So let's go into recap some fun facts here. Most of the damage dealt in the game is caused by criticals. It's not just a rare unit or chaff unit that do more in criticals. It's across the board. Criticals do the most damage. And criticals are unaffected by strength and toughness. Therefore, strength and toughness do not affect the majority of damage dealt in the game. I'll also add in here the attacks and critical damage stat are the prime indicators of total damage output. If you had to, gun to my head, I had to pick only 2 values to look at and pick which profile I thought did the most damage. Those would be the 2 I go with. They should be valued more than strength and base damage. So the overall verdict, I think strength is overrated. I think there's pretty good evidence that attacks is underrated. And I will say I wasn't able to prove conclusively that toughness is overrated. There wasn't the same kind of direct evidence, but it is just directly correlated with strength. So they're together in a system. So since strength is provably overrated, I think toughness would have to be a little bit overrated by association. So hope you enjoyed the video. I'll be back shortly with another Warband video, and thanks.